Turned it on? Right? Are we ready to go? Is that good? Is it good? Can you hear me? Yeah, it's green. It's good? Okay. Okay, I think we're ready to start. Let's... No, it's not a mic. It's the recorder for the video camera. Okay. Hello. Hello. I'm going to start the lecture right now. So if you could take a seat. Thank you. The topic that I'm supposed to cover is actually graphic presentation. And in thinking about the graphic presentation, the immediate thought is that it's going to be a two-dimensional and mostly talking about drawing and ultimately, at this time of the semester, the final presentation. But when thinking about it more carefully and trying to provide you all something a little more useful that may not be specifically for this semester because it is late, but something that you can incorporate in any future semester, I wanted to talk about the drawings in terms of diagrams. And thinking about these diagrams, there's just like any drawings semester or teaching design, there's two parts that we like to have everybody learn about. And one is the idea of presentation and production and actually making and designing a product. And so oftentimes what we see in these final presentations are people who just show the product itself. Plan, section, elevations, diagrams, perspectives, animations that describe that product. And that, although it's very important, is only part of the education of an architect and part of your own education. The other portion, which I actually think is a lot more important, and we talk about quite a bit, is the process of design and how to learn and teach and educate someone in the process of design. And that, too, is the other method and need for drawing critically and diagramming in such a way that is useful to that process. And when done correctly, those diagrams and drawings can all be part of that final presentation, too. So what happens is the intention of these diagrams are designed and made so that they can both be informative to the design as well as informative and communicative to the viewer in the end. So I'd like to talk about diagramming and diagramming in that design process and first go through different categories of diagramming, categories that I actually made up and are not limited to, but can show you the diversity of what diagrams can be in the design process. And then the second part, show you the diagrams as they manifest themselves in presentation drawings. Okay? So let me... So the different types of diagrams I'll talk about, and again, these are very loosely described as well as not limiting diagramming is in some of these categories here that listed, and I'll go through them one at a time. In some of them you see that I use the word diagramming, in others the word mapping. And in a diagram, the difference that I make is that a diagram is more of a drawing that explains a process as opposed to being representational. And a mapping, differently, although it is a type of diagram, is something that actually is more representational sometimes than explanatory. The first type we're going to look at is the conceptual diagram. And this is probably some that you're most commonly accustomed to. It actually is a diagram that you can use in any dimension, in anything from a 2D, 3D type of drawing in trying to portray an idea. So these are historic ones as well as more recent ones, this being a proposal for New York City and how to expand the city not in a vertical or horizontal way, but in these rotational platforms at a completely outrageous scale. And this, too, at a different scale, but conceptual idea of how to make a gateway for Las Vegas. This is a 10-mile gateway. Instead of just slamming into the Las Vegas Strip on the 15, you'd actually go through this 10-mile spiral, continuously being able to gamble and to eat and drink and to watch shows as you're proceeding into the entry to Las Vegas.
No exit.
No, that back, yeah, there's an exit. You enter, right. Some people may not want to exit, but And here's an elevation of that spiral. But here, the common thing that you might hear in a review too is that your elevation or your plan might be diagrammatical or not well worked out. And here too we can say, that that the elevation is obviously very schematic, even though it's a perspective, it's not very well developed and therefore is very diagrammatic. Here, a much more famous image, what Zaha had made originally for the Peak project and became an icon as a diagram for this project conceptually. Positional mapping. Mapping, again, something I talked about as being representational. And so here we have an exploded axonometric of a copier. And this is very related to an architectural drawing because we recognize it as that exploded axonometric, but the pieces and how they relate to each other numerically or numbered in a numerical order of sequencing gives you more information than just the shape of the thing and becomes a representation of the entire thing exploded. And we can apply that also architecturally. This you see in the Lewis project where each portion or component of these floors are actually interlocking and exploded and separated in such a way that we can understand them independently and in relation to each other. We also have data mapping. And data mapping is something where you actually collect information and try to find a way to represent it. So here is the traffic study project by Louis Kahn in Philadelphia. And you can see very simply, the more arrows, the more traffic, the more lanes are represented by the number of lines, and very visually and quickly be able to process that information. Here, on the other hand, is a gene structure where by scale, by size, but not necessarily exact shape, they're able to distinguish the chromosomal patterns of genes. And for us, or I guess mainly scientists, to be able to see the relationships between the different genes themselves. And here, is that blurry? I can't see, sorry. Is a pattern for a book map. And it's a series of books on how they're organized relative to each other, not in the method of a library, but in the story and the ideas behind it. And there's supposed to be words that are floating in the middle, and there's a relative circular pattern of how they're related on the outside. And here again, in a circular manner, this is actually a lock that is designed for a book that when you turn and rotate this lock, it actually can change the identity of the owner. And is clearly also, like I mentioned before, a conceptual piece, not necessarily operational, but starts to diagram that concept and the operation and the mapping of it physically. There's analytic diagramming, where there's an existing structure that by drawing it using different methods can find more information. Here is the tempietto at St. Peter's. You can see with several studies that were applied to it, trying to do it as accurately in scale and dimension as possible to derive other information and ideas from it. And again, a similar thing applied to a bow and the tension and how the tension and the dimensions change proportionately as the string is being pulled. And yet another scale, New York City, the diagrams that are being derived are done in such a way that they may be simple in nature, whether it's just recording the pathways, the grids, and the combining grids, but it's the application of being creative when doing that diagramming so that that diagram itself as an image, as a drawing, can actually be informative formally, spatially, conceptually about what can come next, rather than be a record and end at that point. Here's a diagram that actually is more of a photographic process. Again, it's analytic in the sense that it's trying to do a multiple, exposure? Is that called? A multiple exposure of the different sequence of the cabinetry and trying to record that in a visual way that again has spatial connotations that, as we know, could have been done very simply, planimetrically or sectionally or in a drawing, but simply would not be as effective if not done in a photograph. There's also translation diagramming, where here again it's translation or the notation of dance moves. In the top one, you can see that the notation that was drawn on the floor is literally the movement of the feet, as if the feet were the drawing device. And that's how you can notate the dance move and to translate it to somebody else or communicate that. And on the bottom is actually the figure itself with the movement of the body above the ground floor plane and how to show the contortions of the body itself. Here you see it correlating to musical notes themselves and the staff, so that rhythm and sequencing becomes part of the language in addition to just that single isolated move. In the translation diagrams, I also included this famous Peter Eisenman study of House 4, where you can see that the transformation and the redrawing of each rendition of the house keeps transforming over time. The thing that you do have to remember is that a lot of these drawings, this one especially, was done pre-computer, and so that each of these houses was actually an inked drawing by hand and done as a study as opposed to complete representational or presentational format. Here's another Lewis project where the transformation actually occurred from changing the very diagrammatic World Trade Center and taking it from vertical condition and actually lying it down to put it as an info project. This obviously was done before 9/11, but was a proposal of how to use a lot of the moving systems, elevator shafts, the vertical transportation in a horizontal way, and tried to find a way and a means to be able to relay that in a drawing that was not considered a plan, section, or even hard to call it an axonometric. Demonstrative diagramming. This was kind of a broad and loose category, because on one hand I put this project in here which demonstrates a chair that actually was called, I think it's a smoking stool is what it was called, and as you sit down you can actually see that the design or the drawing itself had a candle that was lit. It would actually light a pipe, and as you stand up this bellow would actually blow the candle out. And so this drawing, again, hard to say that it is a section or an axonometric, but again, I think agreeable that it's more of a diagram or a combination of diagrams becomes very informative of how this thing is being used. And here you have the model just showing how it was built and what it was trying to describe. This drawing model, again, very diagrammatic, is talking about how to control melting ice and allow ice to last longer in a changing climate. As the air temperature is getting warmer and the water temperature is actually changing, they want to preserve the coldness of that top sheet level so that it's useful as an ice sheet. And so this was a proposal to make almost an under blanket to reduce and insulate the lower waters with the upper. And this, like I said, for the demonstrative diagram is a little different than the others. Instead of demonstrating something that happens, it actually starts to move towards the parametric design, where the parametric components actually demonstrate itself. And it's a basket weaving project that here you see the different patterns that result from it. And the diagram itself, where it actually starts to designate where some of these changes and weaving patterns actually occur, to then implement it into a design, or in this case a 3D printing, that utilized some of the patterning that came from the steps. Epigenetic mapping. Epigenetic mapping was coined by Stan Allen a few years back, and it has nothing to do necessarily with the genetic makeup or biological structure, but talk about mapping and how graphs and diagrams and charts can actually be resulting in a more three-dimensional product. So that when we look at some charts and diagrams, you can see by the information, it almost starts to represent a three-dimensional object or thing. In this case, it could be almost like a mountain range that we start to see. Even though the diagram itself is, as you can see, electrical resistivity of copper, gold, and palladium and silver, and has nothing to do with landscaping, the diagram and the way that it's actually designed becomes an implication for 3 dimensions. And here too is a railroad line map that begins to give dimension. Sorry, I don't know what happened. That begins to give dimension here in a more matrix-like pattern, but you can see again in these sections, or what looks like sections to us, are something that can then segue into a formal or spatial condition. Here's another project by David Ross. I lost the picture to follow, but basically is a mapping and a conglomeration of different points of these circles and radii that then produce a three-dimensional form out of it. So, sorry. Here another, by formatting this actual segmenting, or by segmenting different portions of the terrain and finding ways to represent some of these sections in a spiraling pattern, actually then can be, in David Ross's case, was used as a way and a means to develop the design and to look at the landscape in a completely different way, so that the section isn't cut straight across, but is applied in a different segmental method. And here in this project by Ben Addy, he had these floating containers that actually went across, or was proposed to move across the surface of the terrain, and as they move across the surface, like weather patterns and like climate, can actually change the terrain below. So this being, again, that floating device, and the implications of how this thing touched the thing would change the patterning of this. Oh, sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. Change the patterns of the terrain itself. This is also an interesting project because the project itself, I interpreted it as something that drew some very simple diagrams or what we could call diagrams. And this was a climatic threat assembly where steam was made in this device, and as the climate changed, it would allow this entire device to start spinning. And when in the dark you actually used lighting, it would actually light the steam in different patterns. And so as you can see in the sequencing of photos, sorry, here's the assembly altogether. In the sequencing of photos, depending on how the steam is moving as a trajectory or centrifugal force, would change in how it was identified or indexed in the drawing that the thing actually made. So here you can see it turning to heavy circular patterning. There's also cartographic mapping, and that cartographic mapping can actually change existing maps that we have. In this case, this is a map of the United States, but when applied by trying to look at the numbers of Republicans and Democrats in different regions, it actually changed physically the geographic map of the United States to represent that. And it's also a way that I interpret as being an unfolding of surfaces that we mostly consider in architecture as 3 dimensions or elevations, then can actually be unfolded and re-represented in ways that we might not normally see. So in this case, the unfolding could potentially be these elevations, and the design of this device was a method of being able to fold it, unfold it, so that those different spatial relationships actually could be exposed. And this did the opposite, or what I was saying, whereas a container that was 3-dimensional and was then simply unfolded to be shown in 2 dimensions and in a way that we physically could never really look at. Another way that it's shown is in clothing or garment manufacturing. Here is a project that actually was called the weekend coat, and this weekend coat was something that could actually house you all weekend. It had a sleeping component, a shower component, and other things, and was built into it. But you can see in the drawings of this coat, as in any pattern making, is more about the panels themselves and potentially how they're attached than the 3-dimensional. So the combination of photographs we show here with this, and each of these lines shows a different sizing, how to actually make the attachments and seams of connections is pretty common in garment making. It is another way that we can consider is a different kind of mapping or cartography of a 3-dimensional piece. In the process of design, the diagrams are not devised independently or in isolation, and oftentimes could be a method and way to be able to design and produce and generate ideas for the project. So here you have a drawing that actually starts to combine a hybrid of scale and conditions of types of diagrams, from photographic to sketches to hardline pieces, and become not only communicative to the user or the designer themselves, but ultimately can be used as part of that final presentation as communicating the process and where the design came and how it went through these steps to get to the final format. Here is a series of drawings, or I think Perry Culper would prefer called scratchings, that he produced. And these are very large drawings that if he probably would not call these diagrams, but for the purpose of the lecture, I would categorize it in such a way that this hybrid and series of drawings, which took several months to produce, are layers and layers of information that just keep building on itself and compounding, so that finally the drawing in itself becomes what I talked about earlier, is almost that epigenetic field, where you can start to see the formal qualities come out of this thing and potentially lead to the development of sections or plans or elevations or even perspectives. And the information and the way they actually are accumulated on the page can start to develop into that project itself. And finally, presentation diagramming. From here, I actually just put together a whole, not a whole bunch, but a few projects that actually show you a combination of what we consider final presentation or plans, sections, elevations, but incorporate these ideas of diagramming that I talked about. The first few are actually diagrams that are actually designed specifically for presentation, or are not designed during the process, but made as a means and a way, which is most commonly done, I think, in most of your presentations, as an aftermath to communicate the idea. And what I would impress upon you all is when you do have to do these diagrams, anything from circulation diagrams to program diagrams to solar diagrams, ventilation diagrams, think of ways and means to be creative about them. There aren't, it is unnecessary to believe that they have to be a standard format, although they may be things that you don't want to actually cover. They actually can be useful in how you present them relative to your project. So if you consider these diagrams as elements that you're forced to do at the end of a project, then you're probably not considering it as a potential tool as a way to inform your design and your project. So what you need to be doing is you need to be thinking about what that diagram is and to be much more creative about how that diagram is actually generated to be useful to you. So these are actually diagrams that are done at the mat. You can see they're done in such a way that become much more creative than boring, even though the information themselves is very simple, right? The input, the output, the drawing of the sheep, even the simplest things can be done so that they're as compelling as an idea. And even in this case, you can see the titling of some of them are very creative in how to think about it. This is a project that I put in, sorry, I think it's in a little bit of out of order. I'm going to jump ahead here. Where the drawing that I was looking at itself was a combination of what I just said before. It's a combination of three-dimensional drawings, diagrams, and the surfacing models. And as you see them put together, what I did in these previous ones is actually separate them so that you could see it. It's called the clone house, where the idea behind it was there were multiple histories in the same house. And these multiple histories are simply diagrammed out as two different colors in this floor plan. And different colors you can see in the three-dimensional surfacing models. And this project is the urban cow farm where the Kobe beef cows were actually being raised and massaged in the floors above, ready for butchering and for consuming in the restaurant below. And you can see here, even on the sheet of presentation, the combination of three-dimensional drawings done in exploded method, the diagrams run across it, and all the way down to the hand sketches, all become incorporated through color and presentation on the sheet itself. Here are probably some more of the conventional type of diagrams that we're used to seeing, and laid out in a manner that becomes very informative as both three-dimensional formal drawings of the space as well as informational and explanatory of how some of these things actually lay in. So these two drawings actually show the same project, and you can see the sequencing and the layering of information that we get from each of these drawings that don't present it in a way that is so simplified and isolated as a diagram. This was a project or a series of images from the project for the Sheraton Expressway, which is in New York City. And the project was never fully developed, and it poses a huge problem because the vehicle, or the car, becomes a hindrance for the entire area. And there's often traffic problems that are unresolvable in any way. So this project actually proposes looking at areas like that in a more futuristic method, so that the vehicular or transportation systems is much more integrated with unknown systems of the future, as well as hybrid living conditions in between. So it was a series of diagrams that actually investigated different traffic patterns, looking at the existing car, calling the era of Ford, I think it was called Fordism is what he called it, as being the era of the car, but proposed that there's actually a post-Fordism of looking at things that are beyond the car and beyond even just pedestrian movement. So these diagrams you can see cover different speed capabilities of the automobile, turning radii of different types of automobiles, sectional conditions of the car, going through bumps and elevation changes, and different patterns of changing direction and speeds in highways. And these diagrams are some of those that you again wonder whether they were generated early or late in the stage, but because the value of the information, we would expect that they were done fairly early and maybe graphically shored up for final presentation. And here are diagrams that, again, I would suspect are done early in the process, where it actually highlights areas that have either more traffic or have problems or have overlays that need to be done prior to the design process, but are part of the final presentation, and are done in such a way that creatively and aesthetically very appealing to the way that the project itself develops. And as it develops, you can see that the expressway and the different combinations of habitable and movement spaces then generate even more diagrams, which on the right are part of the diagrams that start to appear later in the design process after a lot of the formal early diagrams are generated. And you can see here is actually a physical model on the left, perspective and figure ground drawings of that project. Another project by the firm Smout Allen is a series of drawings and models that I show because, again, you want to be able to look at these things critically and wonder if they are actually diagrams or are they actually architectural drawings, as we know them, meaning plan, section, elevation, axonometric, or 3D. So again, in these sections, I can't see at this angle, in what is actually a plan, I believe, here, what is the threshold between an actual scale drawing that actually is a building plan, building section, and actually a diagram? Oops, sorry, here. So here's a plan, right? And the plan you can see has thicknesses in the walls and it goes around. And then it has other things that actually occur in here that makes you start to think, is it something else? Is it, epigenetic diagramming? Is it actually an underground connection to the earth? What are these things that are integrated so well with this plan itself? And in the section 2, these are lighted compartments that go below, but the way that they're delineated makes you wonder how accurate they are relative to something that's actually a scaled wall thickness above. And the combination of it really captures the essence of the project and beyond giving just hard information. And here you can see the models. The models themselves as artifacts being very tectonic, right, give you a materiality that we recognize. But then when you stop to look at it and start to wonder, what are these openings and what are these other spaces and how scalar and tectonic are they when we talk architecturally? And here's a drawing too, which again, we have to say is quite a beautiful drawing, extremely detailed, and I'm sure to scale. But then we have things incorporated in here that are recognized as diagrammatic modes, like arrows and other elements that actually give us more information than just the simple aerial three-dimensional quality. Here's a project that I put in here because it's very well documented as a process project. It's the Diller Scofidio Slow House. And it's, although an older project, still to me exemplifies the steps in the project of how even as a process becomes product in presentation in the end. That without the series or looking at the series of drawings or models throughout the developmental process is not as powerful. And the hopes is that, I guess what I'm trying to portray to you all is that it's those things that become also powerful in the final presentation of your project, because the critique of the project that you do is not only on the final product that you produce, it's also on the process of how you got there. Now, that may not be the case when you are working in the field and your clients are not necessarily or always interested in the education of that process in between, but it's part of the education as an architect in school. So here you have some early conceptual models, right? This is the conceptual model, which again, we can, even though it's a three-dimensional product, is done in a schematic manner that can qualify in that diagrammatic method. And the sections that are generated from basically a drawing machine that they design themselves and actually produce in order to almost imply the design of the project automatically. And all the models and the drawings, you can see this, the models and drawings are combinations of drawings, are combinations in themselves, so that in this model, these panels are actually can slide out on these tracks and actually have the sections that are drawn on the panels, the panels. So when we talk about drawings and models, oftentimes it is not easy, or it may not be easy to separate them, but it's all part of that same project implication. And here you can see all the structural diagrams, the layout of the pages, the curvature of the surfaces, and the conceptual model itself. And like I said, the conceptual model here in the next image, you can see was utilized as a photograph into this collage that became a drawing with the same television monitor. Are you guys familiar with this project in general, right? So the slow house is basically a design of moving through it, and ultimately when you reach the end and you believe that you reach the view, instead you're actually looking at a monitor that simulates that view. And here's just an early construction photograph. This is the last project that I'm actually going to show, and it's a presentation of very beautiful drawings. And part of the reason why I wanted to show this is because it shows you actual boards that are put together of a project and a combination of images, and done in such a way so that it's very aesthetically appealing. The thing that I see that is done very often in school and here at USC is that when it comes time for final presentation, everything just seems to get crammed and slapped on boards, so that the idea is if I just put everything I can on there somewhere, if they search around, they'll find what they want to see. But you have to use your boards in such a way so that, again, thinking about the diagramming of a person viewing the board, there are some very important elements that you're trying to communicate, i.e. the drawing themselves, and that the layout graphically of it, even though you're not trained as graphic designers, should be done in a very graphic manner to be appealing and representational of your idea and concept. So here's a series of boards that you can see that does that, where there is quite a bit of white space, which I think students oftentimes like to fill up with a lot of stuff in here. And you see also the proportions of the images to text is quite different. When you look at these boards, the first thing that you look at are the scale and the size of some of the images first, before even considering the text. So I also urge everyone that to not forget to put your text in there necessarily, but the text should be there as a secondary element, especially when your final review is a verbal, physical, oral presentation versus a text in a book. So again, you can see too that these boards lack a big title block on every page and the need to do that. And again, the text is legible, but not a major element on how to review these boards. And like I said before, some of the images are a combination of actual architectural drawings and diagramming. So again, the proportions of the board, the amount of space for the eye to rest on an entire board is disproportionate if you think about it to the size and scale of the element on it, but presents the project in a way that is very appealing to the viewer. With different kind of diagrams and images all around. Okay, so that's it. Do I do any of this stuff? I don't know what's supposed to happen here.
Yeah. Doris, could you characterize what a